Hello, everyone. Hey, Barbara. Hey, Jenna. Can you hear me? Hey, John.
Hello.
Good. You can hear me?
I
Yes,
can.
ma'am. Hello.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Sorry. I never know if I forget my microphone or not. Let's
I
just, hey,
sorry
Barbara.
about that.
No, don't worry. No worries. We'll just give this a few minutes. Agnes will probably be here. Nancy is still not with us tonight. She's still in Nashville. So, and I think Linda is going to try to join tonight. Do we have Lydia tonight, John, or?
Trying. We're in separate locations tonight,
Oh,
and so
oh,
she's had problems before logging on via her phone, but
I know she has.
we thought maybe we had sorted them out. So we'll see.
We'll see. If not, we'll have the recording. So we'll have this week and next week, and then I'll give you guys a break for the summer, if that's okay. This is just a really heavy chapter. If you haven't noticed, it's long, but there's a lot of things that need to be said. So we set ourselves up for the rest of Genesis, and I kind of want you guys to get a grasp of what's actually happening here and why, because this can be a really disturbing story.
I was thinking of that because you probably may have seen last week, the Texas legislature has directed that uh, public school children read the Bible.
Yes.
But one of the books they've directed they read is Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking,
Oh
well,
God.
that's interesting, leaving aside all the practical problems like, well, whose translation are you going to use?
Yes.
Um,
Uh-huh.
but then I was thinking all the parents, not only in Texas, who rail
Hmm.
against the sexual content of books in their school libraries, what are they going to make of Lot's daughters getting their
Yeah.
father drunk?
Yeah. Very, very true, right, John? Right. And also the story of, Dinah and Shechem, when she's raped, Jacob's daughter. And really, hi, Agnes. What bothers me the most about this is like who feels qualified to teach this?
It's, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I
Hmm.
would have said this is so patently and facially unconstitutional. It'll never
Hmm.
be upheld, but
Hmm.
I have no confidence anymore in my ability to predict
Yeah.
the Supreme Court. But it does open all this stuff does open up huge, to me, practical problems. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, it's it's like it's maddening to me, mostly as a lawyer, but also as an American. I mean, we're going to read the Bible. Well, whose Bible? The
Yeah.
Catholics and Orthodox Bible has different books than
Yeah.
whose
Oh, yeah,
Lutheran Bible are
absolutely.
you going to pick?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Who do you
Once you
pick?
do that, then you have the government exercising a preference for one religion over another, and
Hmm.
because we don't really care about Jews, Muslims,
Hmm.
Hindus.
Hmm. Hmm.
The
Yeah,
New Testament isn't their Bible.
I hear you. Right. Yeah. And who does the interpretation of this, right? What stories do you choose? Why do you choose them? And who is qualified to teach them? Right. Because we certainly know the harm that can come out, like how much you can weaponize scripture.
Mm.
Anyway,
And
that's not why we're here tonight. It struck me when I read that, and I was looking at and not only do they prescribe Bible readings, but particular ones for particular grades. And I thought,
yeah,
Genesis, geez, there's a whole lot of content in Genesis that in other contexts, most Texans would say is completely inappropriate for children.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And you can weaponize scripture to your own bias. It's very dangerous. I mean, we certainly did it during the Civil War, right, to justify slavery.
Mm.
Dangerous. So we've lost Agnes. I don't know what happened to Agnes.
Get
She's
tired of
probably
me hearing me rant. Signed
she's
off.
probably it's probably some internet instability. I don't know if we'll have Linda tonight, but we'll get started. We'll wait for Lydia to. Oh, Suzanne. Hello, Suzanne. Um, so we'll just open with prayer and we'll get started because, like I said, I think this is going to take us like 2 weeks to get through. It's very long, but it's also complex and it's very different, right? Remember the theology. Remember the Jacob narrative is a lot of theology, the same as Isaac's narrative, right? It's not as straightforward as Abraham. Um, there's a lot of background stuff that we need to know about this, and I'm hoping that we can, in the next 2 weeks, just get it straight so that you feel comfortable with this and moving forward to it. Because, like I said, this is a disturbing story on many accounts, and it's really disturbing. You're like, why is this in the, why is this in scripture? This is completely crazy. But I hope in 2 weeks it will totally make sense to you guys. Stop me when you need to stop me. Voice questions, concerns, and we'll see what we can do. We'll open with prayer for that guidance. The Lord be with you.
Also with
And
you.
also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for bringing us to yet another night to share your word and your wisdom and your love. We pray, O Lord, that you be present with us to help us understand texts that seem not to speak to our world today, but in fact do deeply. Give us that understanding that we can take these words of yours and to apply them in our everyday life, that you have given us to give us guidance and wisdom and to make this world a better place. Create all of creation with equality, respect, and dignity. All this we ask in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So before I start spewing, does anybody have any questions or comments about last week? Concerns about last week? So does anybody have something pressing that has to be said about tonight's text before we start?
Well, I had the question that I sent to you.
You did, Barbara. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So Barbara's question, and I believe, Barbara, that this touches on the oracle that's given to Rebecca, correct?
Right.
Yeah, in terms of free will versus predestination, right? Do you want to word that question, Barbara, or does everybody kind of know where Barbara's coming from? Is anybody else feeling like Barbara? Like if there really is such a thing as free will, human free will, right? How does God, give this oracle to Rebecca that says, the elder will serve the younger, right? That kind of seems like God is forcing the issue and pushing the sovereignty button, and kind of says, how does free will fit into that? Is that correct, Barbara? Is that a good way to state it?
Well, I wasn't sure.
Mm-hmm.
So when I read this,
Yeah.
it did seem like that was the decree, and if that's the decree, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But so no matter what she did, it was going to happen. Or is is God he just knows what they're going to do, so he's kind of just saying, look, this is what's going to happen because you people did whatever. So I wasn't sure which way to look at it. I mean, I kind of think he's not just sitting back saying, oh, all right, you guys, figure it out and I'll just let you know. He's not like a fortune teller. So it was a little confusing, because then you wonder, where does free will come in? Is it
Yeah.
free will? Is it preordained? And that was my question.
Yeah. Which is,
Darling, where were they? In the seat in the council.
I'm sorry. So yeah, Barbara, so when you say that, right, you have hit on one of the theological nails, right, of this story. People have questioned that is a really poignant question that has been asked down through the centuries since this writing. It is still debated today. Is there a right or wrong answer? It's all a matter of theological interpretations. And I'm going to give you a couple ways that theologians have interpreted this down through the ages, right? I'm not going to give you the big fancy names that go with them unless you want them. I'm happy to share them. But I mean, and this is a question that runs through all of Scripture, right? Is human free will versus God's election, right? God's predestination. Now, there are some scholars, right? Many scholars will say there is a way for both of them to live side by side. And the way that we can say that, Barbara, is that God has this foreknowledge, right? If God exists outside of human time, as we know that God is, meaning that God can break through human history, but God isn't isn't restricted, right, by the way that we keep track of time. And we know just scientifically, and if Susan were here tonight, she, as a scientist, would give us a much better explanation than I'm going to. But we know that scientifically, something happens in the universe to time the further out we get, right? And so we know that we believe the way that God views time isn't with these milestones like we view it, but that God is rather kind of seeing time simultaneously. Meaning that, right, and we see this substantiated in the Psalms when when the psalmist talks about, a minute being like 1,000 years, right? So God has already kind of God has seen the whole scope of human history. How God knows, right? How Christ is able to say that, yeah, there will come a time when justice prevails. And it's because God is able to see this whole scope of history and knows the beginning as well as the outcome altogether, right? And so there are scholars who say, well, God has been able to look at the whole scope of history. And when he gives this oracle to Rebecca, already knows because he has seen it played out, right? It's an oracle. And he's seen that's the way it's played out, and he's able to tell Rebecca this is what's going to happen. Make sense so far, everyone?
I mean, it sounds a little bit like, it's like a science fiction book, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the mysteries of God, right? But that is one of the explanations. The other explanation, um, it's very close to that, right? But it talks about middle knowledge. And the middle knowledge is that God knows the heart. And he's been able to see, and this one's a little far-fetched, that God has been able to see history play out, right? And understands the decisions that people will make. Okay, and then sets up the universe so that those decisions are played out according to his will and plan. That's a hard one, right? Very much true, right? It never says there's not, and both of them allow for room for human free will, right? It's just that God has this foreknowledge or this middle knowledge of how we're going to react in those situations. A, because he's either seen the scope of history, or B, because he understands the heart. He has shaped the heart and understands how we'll respond in circumstances, right?
How come that, I mean, I think I follow that, but how come that doesn't vitiate or eradicate free will then?
How doesn't that,
I
well,
mean,
because, mhm.
well, yeah, I guess I'll leave my question like that.
So because John, because God has seen, because God can see history as one, right? That God has seen the choices that we make and is able to predict what we're going to do in circumstances because God has seen the choices our hearts make, right? So let's see if we can put that in a very human example. So for all your moms and dads, right? You pretty much know how your kids are going to respond to certain things, correct?
That's just what I was thinking, that example, that,
Mm-hmm.
you can ask your kids a question and be probably 99% sure you're going to get the right answer.
Yeah, exactly,
You know the
Suzanne.
answer ahead of time. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so I
and
think God knows, he's got 100% knowledge.
yeah, of how we're going to respond in those circumstances, right? So I'm not a parent, but I'm a pet parent, and I know if I do certain things, I know how Francis is going to react, right? And so if I have a plan, right, and I want to set that plan in motion, and I have a pretty good idea of how he's going to act, I'm going to set up those circumstances so that he acts that way. So today, right, I know that when I'm not here, he hates the air conditioner. So he's going to go into the bedroom and he's going to sit on the bed. And if I put treats on that bed, right, he might not come out to eat his food, but he's going to eat those treats on the bed. So I put those treats on the bed, and lo and behold, I come home. Maybe he's not eating the food, but he's eaten the treats. I've set up the situation, the circumstances, so that he will respond in the way that I want him to respond, right? But just because I know him. And this is the basic idea of what's called Molinianism. Molina was the theorist who devised this perspective. And it basically says that God knows how each of us are going to respond. God has seen it. And so God sets up that when God set up the universe, set up these circumstances for us to respond in that way. Again, it allows for free will, right? Neither one of these theories say, no, you're not acting by your own desires. It's just more of a knowledge on the part of God. Does that make sense? Then,
Well,
go ahead.
okay, so I mean, I think I'm gonna ask the same question that John
It's okay,
just
Barbara.
asked.
That's
So,
okay.
so how
Ask
is it, how does that, I understand, I understand what you're saying, that you kind of know how somebody's gonna react, and
Yep.
but then how does it make it not predetermined for that person? And I mean, I mean, I guess they still have free will. You just happen to know
Yeah.
what it's going to be, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Because in the situation, and again, as parents, right? But as a pet parent, right? I'm not forcing Francis to do that. I'm not forcing him to go into the bedroom and eat those treats. It's just that I know that's what he's going to do, right? And so I set up the circumstances with that. He can always decide he's not going to. But, from the viewpoint of God, God has seen our choices in our lives and is able to know that's how we're going to respond to those choices, right? Doesn't stop in as it relates to Genesis 27. It doesn't nothing stops Jacob from deceiving his father, right? Nothing stops Rebecca from being, part and parcel to that. It's just that God has seen their choices and gets, this is what's going to happen. If these circumstances happen, these are how each of these four players are going to react. And now God has set up the circumstances that will fall into place and eventually, carry through God's will. Yeah, I know. These aren't easy. These aren't easy to grip. I know that. But these are the way that scholars have tried to answer this question. The other one, which I really like, and a lot of scholars call this functionalism. So I'm assuming, Barbara, I know that you've done a lot of studies in Paul recently, right?
Oh, yes,
Yeah, who talks a lot about free will, right?
yes.
And so has anybody thought of this? So there's two places in scripture where this story of Esau and Jacob is talked about. One specifically, the oracle, one specifically in Romans 9, when Paul talks about, they didn't do anything good, they didn't do anything bad. It was
Right.
just predestination, right? That God said it that way. We will also see this in Malachi when Malachi talks about God hated Esau, which is a total wrong interpretation, translation on our part, right? Just means that God less favored Esau. So a lot of people look at Romans 9 and say, well, aha, that is predestination and pre-election right there. However, the rather newer theory of this, and I think this is a really great theory for these circumstances, is that this really isn't talking about salvation history, right? This is talking about two nations and what nation will be subject to the other nation, right? It has nothing to do with Esau's going to go to hell or Jacob's going to heaven, right? Has nothing about the damnation of their souls. It doesn't mean that Esau is precluded from having a relationship with God. It doesn't mean any of those things. What it means is that there were two nations in Rebecca's womb, right? And one of those nations was going to be indebted to the other nation. And so it's really not, when we think about, predestination and the elect of, some are destined to go to heaven, right? And some are destined to go to hell. It's really not that at all. What Paul is simply saying in Romans 9 is that, yeah, there were two nations and, it was God's will that this nation be subjected to the other nation. Now, I'm hoping once we actually look at this story, you'll understand why it was really, really important for this to happen. It was really important for Jacob to be the one that's going to carry the blessing, right? Esau would not have legally been able to carry the blessing, even if all of this scheming didn't happen. Esau was ineligible. And do you know why? Do you remember why? I think we briefly hit this.
Because
He
he
married a
married.
Canaanite.
Yes, because he married pagan women, right? He did not marry according to Abrahamic command. And that would have made all of this null and void. He would not have been allowed to carry this promise. His children would not have been, because his children would have been deemed illegitimate. And we will see that Esau, right, very much has a free will, as much as Jacob, right? And how God's plan is being played out despite all of these people. Now, let me step back for a moment and say this. This is not a moral story about a dysfunctional family.
Mhm.
We can read it like that, right? And when we read it on the surface, it sounds like it's a moral story about a dysfunctional family. It is not. It has absolutely nothing to do with morality, right? As much as our senses want to be shocked by this story, and as much as we want to say, well, why did God allow a blessing that's going to lead to the Messiah, no less, be obtained through trickery and deception? Sounds crazy, right? But the purpose of this story is more to show us, and when the narrator wrote this story, put this story down in paper, it was more to show us that God's plan happens despite human sin. That despite all of these really awful choices that our free will is guaranteed to make, right? Because that's what free will assumes, right? When we talk about free will, it assumes that it's never really going to make the godly choice for the most part. It's always going to make a choice that is good for us. And when God fits into that, okay, great, God fits into that. But that's not always the case. Given God's will and our will, we usually don't, right? This is how the fall happens in the first place, right? We don't always choose God. And so this story, the Jacob narrative, wants to say to us, right? We saw this a little bit in Abraham, but this is much different, right? This is a narrative that's written in a different location. It's not probably doesn't get handed down from the Southern Kingdom, where things are a little more by the book, orthodox, right? It gets written in the Northern Kingdom at a little bit of a different time than the older material, right? And the thing with this is this writing, the authors that write this want us to see that despite ourselves, the promise and the blessing go on because God is sovereign, despite human will. So that is a long and contorted way, Barbara, to say to you, this story acknowledges human will more than it doesn't.
Mhm.
Well, the way I look at it is, Abraham was given a promise and Sarah decided she was going to manipulate things to make it come true. It didn't work out.
Yeah.
Rebecca and she decided she was going to manipulate things, and this time the outcome was what God wanted. If she had chosen not to, it still would have happened.
It still would have happened, Suzanne. Yes, that is a correct assumption, right? It's not an assumption. That is correct, right? Both of these women take matters into their own hands, right? Because they don't trust God enough to see through what God has promised. Because it's very difficult, right? When your child is and you're 90 years old and you've been promised 25 years, you're going to have an heir. It's very easy to take things into your own hands, right? To try to take things into your own hands. Yes, Rebecca, right? But now bear in mind, the thing that makes Rebecca and Sarah different is that Rebecca has been given this oracle, right? And when she hears Isaac, you know, sees that he's ready to call Esau in to give the blessing, she's kind of acting like an instrument of God, even in her deception, right? Because now Isaac has taken things into his own hands. He probably knew this oracle, right? He must have known that God was destining Jacob to be the son that was going to carry the promise, that was going to be the son that God willed to be blessed. And yet Isaac takes things into his own hands. Why? Because Esau's his favorite son.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say Esau was his favorite and Jacob
Mhm.
was Rebecca's favorite.
Yeah. And so this whole thing while Rebecca, right? Because I am a huge fan of Rebecca and Jacob both, right? While it looks like they're really the schemers, and yeah, they have a role to play, all four of them are manipulate, right? They're manipulating this whole situation, right? Not any of those four are innocent in this.
Oh, they all look
However,
bad. You're right.
they all look bad, Barbara, right? It's a dysfunctional family, right? And if you read, like, when you read this narrative, like, there's a lot of things in the Isaac narrative, which is relatively short, right? There are a lot of things that Isaac loves. He loves Rebecca, right? He loves Esau. He loves stew. He loves game. There is one missing element in this of what is not said that Isaac loves, and that's Jacob. Esau is always my son, and Jacob is always her son. And so, when Isaac has the opportunity to do the actual will of God, right, by bestowing the blessing on the son that was radically chosen by God to upend human convention, to upend social norms, right? It didn't happen. The older son always got the birthright. The older son always got the blessing. When it comes, but certainly Isaac was aware, right? There's this oracle from God that says that's not the way it's going to happen this time. Isaac has it in his ability to make sure that God's will is done, and he doesn't. He goes by his own will. He chooses by his own will which son he wants to give the blessing to.
But then that goes back to what you were saying before, and that is he's thwarted by that, and the
Mhm.
plan, God's plan, goes forward
Yeah,
regardless of these four maniacs that are down here trying to change everything.
absolutely, Barbara. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, yeah. And so that's kind of a perfect example, right? Does Isaac have free will? Could have Isaac gone forward with God's plan the way that God, tells Rebecca that this is going to happen? Sure, he could have. But Isaac uses his free will, right? To do what he wants to do. He wants the son that he loves to inherit the blessing. Um, and that's huge, right? That's huge. And it's really huge, not only because he goes against the will, the expressed will of his God, right? But because this story doesn't exactly paint Esau in a really good light, right? Now, step back for a minute. There are scholars who will say, "Oh, Esau is such a sympathetic character in this text. And how terrible." And that's scheming Jacob, right? That's what Jacob means, supplanter, right? He comes out of the womb trying to be the one on top, right? And he doesn't change. He doesn't change in his life until, he wrestles with God, right? And there's this reckoning. Jacob always is an intruder. His whole life, he's intruding on something, right? That doesn't excuse Jacob. But there's a lot of people who will put Esau, right? Say, well, he is just a trickster. He is just no good. And poor Esau. I don't want you to think that way, right? Because Esau is not put in a good light. Esau's put in a very good life when it comes to redemption, right? And making up with his brother. Esau, that's very noble of Esau and shows a maturation of Esau, right? But this beginning stories between this and the one where he sells his birthright to Jacob do not shed Esau in a good light. So why? Why? What are your feelings of Esau?
Well, he married outside the covenant. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't think much of his birthright if he was
Mm-hmm.
willing to sell it to his brother for a pot of dinner, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly,
It,
Suzanne, right?
he didn't seem to care much about the God and the promises.
Yeah, he doesn't. He doesn't, right? He is not the spiritual creature. As the older son, right? So the birthright has a couple meanings in the ancient Near East. Excuse me, not a couple meanings. Has a couple of perks that come with a birthright in the ancient Near East. One of them is a double portion of the inheritance, right? The elder son always gets a double portion of the patriarch's inheritance when he dies, right? And that's very nice. But there's also this spiritual element of the birthright. And we might see this happening in this text, right? Some of this hidden stuff we don't know about. And that would mean that the birthright would allow the elder son to kind of be the spiritual representative of the family, right? So in this case, we know that Isaac is suffering from some kind of ailment, right? His sight is not that good. It's probably acute. It probably hasn't been brewing for a long time. The text is written like it's just like a sudden thing. He thinks he's dying. Do you know how long after this story happens that Isaac actually dies? I'll give you a hint. It's not tomorrow.
I believe
He
it said 43 years.
Yeah, like I think it's actually like 63 years. He lives
Oh,
between like 50
okay.
and 63 years later, right? He's not dying, right? He's got some blindness going on. He can't see that well. His senses all seem to be impaired, right? He doesn't smell that well. Apparently doesn't taste that well. But he lives for a very long time after this story is written. He is not on the threshold of death. He's just ready to pass on this blessing, right? To Esau. He wants to get this done. Now, because he is in some kind of debilitated condition, right? And don't let the word old fool you. That's kind of a generic term in Genesis. Jacob will use it about himself when he's a mere 137 years old. It's just a generic term. Um, and Isaac says here, I don't know the day of my death, but he's just assuming and he's ready to give the blessing. And if this disability of Isaac's was for any length of time, it would have meant that Esau had already taken over the spiritual realm of the family, right? Let me step back here for a minute. There is no such thing as 21st century individualism in the ancient Near East. No such thing, right? Judaism and the ancient Near East at the time when this is written, about 2000 BCE, when the time this takes place, is a collective corporate identity. Okay. And what makes the birthright so important in a corporate, in a society that has a corporate identity, do you know? Do you have a guess? Well, because of the fate of the
They would take
family.
over a lot of the financial stuff. They would take over leading the tribe.
Yeah, they would essentially become, right, they'd be the anchor person for the entire family. And so, this double inheritance isn't like, oh my gosh, it's a windfall, right? It is the money that would have been necessary to keep the clan going. So the blessing has the ability to make or break a family, right? The person whose hands the blessing is put in can make or break a family, right? right? It can mean life or it can mean death. Both financially, right? Because you don't survive outside of your tribe. Your tribe is your survival. Isolated people don't make it in the ancient Near East when they live in tribal societies, right? But also spiritually. So if Isaac has been, going downhill for a little bit, right? There is no Levitical priesthood at this time, right? So it would have meant that Esau, the spiritual responsibilities would have fallen into Esau's hands also. When we talk about these special clothing that Rebecca takes from her tent, there are Jewish rabbinic, right, the Midrash, the rabbinic writings say that these were the priestly garbs that Isaac would have, that Isaac would have worn. And then as he got old, as he got more debilitated, Esau would have worn also. There were priestly outer garments, priestly robes. Rabbinic tradition also tells us, which is just this great fun thing, is that those robes that were in the possession of Isaac and handed down to Esau were the skins that God had made to clothe Adam and Eve. That's such a beautiful tradition, right? Handed down through Noah and Abraham to Isaac and to Esau. So there's this socioeconomic part of the birthright, right? But there's this also spiritual thing that comes with the birthright also. And obviously, Esau could have cared less about any of it, right? He's very carnal. He's very immediate gratification. He's brave. He's a hunter. He doesn't care about the spiritual realm. He doesn't care about this promise that's been given, to his grandfather. He doesn't care about any of these things. But we do get a clue, when there's these descriptions of Jacob, right? He dwells among the tents. Remember in that one chapter we read, and it said, Esau was a hunter, but Jacob, dwelt in tents, right? He cares about family tradition. He's quiet. He's reflective. The promise means something to him. He might not have that personal relationship with God right now that Abraham had and that Isaac also has, right? He clearly doesn't have the personal relationship with God, right? He calls Yahweh your God to his father, and then he uses God's name in vain when he swears he's his brother. He clearly does not have a relationship with God. What we'll see in the next chapters, right? When he has the dream of the ladder, he wasn't even aware that God was present, right? Until it kind of hits him in the head. He is not a saint, right? He is not this spiritual being, but he has the potential to be, right? Unlike Esau, who could care less. Questions, comments? That was a lot for me to say. And I think that when we look at it, like I'm just looking at my notes, I have notes everywhere tonight because it is so complex. I think that when we look at this story in light of that, right, it kind of lessens Rebecca's actions. There's many scholars who will disagree with me. And I'm not saying that she's totally innocent, right? She certainly schemes to deceive, and her deception puts Jacob's life in jeopardy, right? Because Esau wants to kill him.
Mm.
Her deception, she deceives her husband. She steps into a cultural role where she really didn't have a place, right? She's a brave woman. Inheritance was not a woman's theater, right? She does it. She steps outside of her cultural role. She puts Esau in jeopardy also, right? I mean, if he would have killed Jacob, there would have been blood revenge, right? That's what the law that governed the ancient Near East at this time, meaning that if you killed someone, your blood was demanded. we see Rebecca refer to this when she says, why should I lose two of them today, right? She sends Jacob off back to Haran to her brother Laban. And that is a reference to blood revenge. She puts all three of them in very bad situation. She forces her precious son to lie. She puts his life in jeopardy. And and there's consequences. And Barbara, going back to your question about the free will, right? And I know that when you wrote me, you had asked about like the consequences, right? You had mentioned something
Right.
about consequences of behavior, right? There is consequences for all of these characters, right? Again,
Definitely.
another sign of free will, right? Jacob is must leave, right? The social circle. He must leave the security of that tribe because his life is now endangered. And he doesn't come back for 20 years, right? Rachel forever loses her son, this child who she loves so. Excuse me, I keep calling Rachel. That is Jacob's favorite wife. Rebecca loses Jacob forever. She dies before he comes back. Isaac will live to see Joseph sold into slavery. But Rebecca will not see Jacob again. She loses him, right? The consequences of what she's done. And what are the consequences to Isaac? Well, his favorite son doesn't get the blessing, right? And in fact, what he has to give Esau is really like an anti-blessing. It's almost a curse. It is the reverse blessing of Jacob that we'll talk about when we get to that part. So, like all human choices, there's consequences, and they all face the consequences of this. Again, showing that God can work through these really persnickety things, right? Nothing stops God's plan. Questions, comments?
I did think one thing was very interesting, and it
Mhm.
might be that I just jumped ahead because I kind of
Mhm.
wanted to have the story.
Mhm.
uh, so there's at one point where he's leaving, and Isaac gives him another blessing. I mean, even though he knows how he got the first blessing.
Yeah, Barbara. Yes. So, that happens in chapter 28, right? The chapter that follows this. So a few things of this, right? Remember that that scripture, but particularly the Hebrew Bible isn't really big on emotions, right? We don't know what Isaac must have felt after he gives the wrong son the blessing. But it is apparently very, very devastating to him, right? It exceedingly, what is the words that's used? He's exceedingly
He
some
trembles violently, I
he
think is
trembles
the phrase.
violently.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, he trembles violently. Um, oh, it's Esau who exceedingly cries out, right? Yeah, he trembles violently. Now, is this because his favorite son hasn't gotten the blessing, or is this because he realizes that he has gone against God, right? This realization that yes, I have put my will above my God's, right? My personal God's will. And so when he gives the blessing, right, to who he thinks is Esau, right? When Jacob gets the initial blessing, it has really two focuses, right? One that's very earthly, like the dew, right? He wishes him great dew. Why great dew? Well, because in that part of the country, it only rained twice a year. And so crops survived through the dew of the morning. So dew was essentially more important than rain in that area of the world. He wishes him, wine and corn, right? The signs of prosperity and blessing. And he also gives him the blessing also includes very historical things, right? Like dominion, right? Power over family members, right? You can lord it over your brother. There's nothing spiritual in that blessing, Barbara. Right? There's absolutely no spiritual blessing. The promise is not handed down in that blessing. Again, it's historical and very material, earthy, but it changes in 28. The blessing changes. When Jacob is given that blessing, that becomes the spiritual blessing. And that he gives in full knowledge, right? It's right here in 28, 28:4, may he give to you the blessing of Abraham. That's the promise to you and to your offspring. So Isaac inevitably gives Jacob the spiritual blessing. It's not given here. And why doesn't he give it? Well, perhaps he really knew, right? We can get inside Isaac's mind. Perhaps he really knew that Esau was not worthy of that blessing. Esau was not worthy of that spiritual blessing. And it's kind of withheld in this chapter, right? But then in 28, there is this turnabout where Jacob actually gets the spiritual blessing that includes the promise.
Mm.
So while he loves Esau tremendously, right? There is another side to that remorse and that fear and that trembling, right? Is that he now knows he has gone against God's will. He withheld the full force of the blessing. And probably thinking, well, he's my favorite kid, right? But I still don't think that he's worthy of to carry this promise. But it does turn around in 28. Questions, comments? So, we would probably say today in the modern world, so what? Just take it back, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
read your mind, John. Yes,
Yeah.
so what? So, and we would do that today, right? So I want to talk to you a little bit about how words were thought of in the ancient world, right? So the word for word in Hebrew is devar. And while we think of a word as something very abstract, right? It is, again, Susan as a scientist would clarify this, but it is what is it? A sound wave, it's a wave, it goes out into the world and it's there and it's gone forever. And we use it to describe things. We use it in the present tense. We use it for all kinds of things, right? That are one-dimensional. But that's not the case in the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, a word is something physical, right? Think of a word in the ancient Near East like an arrow that shot out of a bow, right? It has a target, and once it's released, it has a life of its own. Words could determine futures in the belief of ancient people in this region, right? They had a life of their own. They were prophetic. Once they were released to the world, it was believed that that was enough to shape a future, and they could not be rescinded. So once this blessing becomes part of the world out of Isaac's mouth, there is no taking it back. There is no saying, whoops, mistake. The physical being of that word has been given to the universe, and now it develops its own life, and it shapes futures. So how can we think of this today, right? And I was thinking today when I was coming into work and getting ready to come into work this morning, like, what is a way that we could understand that today? And believe me, this just comes from me. This is not anything from a scholar, right? But today, words have consequences also, right? Words can still shape futures. And we see this, with kids who grow up with parents, family members who aren't that supportive, right? and they tell you over and over, you're this, you're no good, you're the greatest, right? We tend to live into those words because those words take a life once they come out of our mouths, right? Our words have consequences and they do shape people and they do shape futures, right? If you like the story of Lady Gaga, right? She was tremendously bullied and she was really determined not to make those words a reality because words can become a reality. And that's really a good way to think about it, right? In the context of the ancient Near East and what the word debar means in Hebrew. It determines the future. It has a reality to it. And once it's released to the universe, you can't take it back. Spoken word has that much power. Questions, comments about that? And it's so powerful, right? It can't be altered. Whatever's said can't be altered. Once Isaac has given that blessing, the future is shaped. There's no retracting it. It's very much like a prophecy. It is a prophecy, right? He has said, this is what's going to happen, and this is what's going to happen. And we know, right? If we look at history, if we look at biblical history, we know this is what happened. We know that this is what happens with Edom, right? Esau actually does go up to the mountains of Seir, and which has been described by many historians like hell on earth. It's one of the most desolate places on earth, right? It rains very little. Agriculture cannot survive in that. And so people have to adapt, right? There's a lot of mining. They do a lot of copper mining in that area, but for the most part, they're bandits. They're marauders. And so when this comes about, when this anti-blessing, right, that is kind of the reverse of Jacob's blessing, right? Let's just look at this for a minute. Okay. So when we see this blessing, right? If you go to 27:27, right? He smells the garments. And this is a beautiful thought too, right? There are scholars who say that when Isaac smells the garments that were kept in Sarah's tent. Why? Because they're holy garments, and not Sarah, Rebecca, they're kept in Rebecca's tent. They're holy garments. Rebecca wasn't going to let these holy garments be kept in Esau's wife's tents, right? Because they're pagans. So Rebecca would have had these garments in her tent, right? They would have been kept with flowers to keep moths away, right? They didn't have mothballs, but they would have been kept with really fragrant flowers to keep them preserved. Isaac smells that, right? He doesn't smell the sweat and blood on Esau and identify that. He smells these holy robes, these holy garments. And he says, they smell like the flowers of the wild flowers of the field, right? The smell of a field. And there's scholars, and this is just so beautiful, who say, oh yeah, this is reminiscent of Eden, right? This beautiful paradise. And immediately Isaac smells this and it takes him back, the thought of Eden. And he says, yes, this is the one then, right? Because up to this point, he's not quite sure this is Esau. But when he smells this and he thinks, right, as the rabbis would say, of Eden, he's like, this must be, right? This is the promise of the promised land. This is the new Eden, right? And he smells this and he blesses him, right? He blesses him with the dew of heaven. Again, the survival of the land, not with the rain, the dew that's actually keeping, maintaining fertility, survival, the fatness of the earth, all the riches of the earth, right? The plenty of grain and wine. And then this socio-political blessing, right? Let people serve you. Nations are going to bow down to you. You're going to lord over your brothers, your mother's sons, right? He gives this blessing to erroneously to Jacob, right? But if we look, right, we look what happens when Esau actually enters the scene, right? It's really kind of ironic because we can only imagine, where's this quote? I have a beautiful quote written about this distress of Esau. We can almost see him just like his father, just trembling and bitterly crying out. And there's one theologian, and I forget who it is, says, this has got to be like the most pathetic cry in the entire Bible when he realizes that he's been duped again, right? His words all play on Jacob's name. Remember, names have significance. They indicate who we are. Esau's name means red and hairy, right? The way he was born. Jacob's name means supplant, because when he comes out of the womb, he's holding on to Esau's heel, trying to be the first one out. And Esau's like, he supplanted me again. He supplanted me in the womb. He supplanted my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing, right? And he pleads with Isaac. And it's almost a play on words, the Hebrew word that's used for this plea that this cry that he's crying out to Isaac, right? Remember what Isaac's name means? He laughs, right? And now the son of the man who laughs, right, is now bitterly weeping and pleading that, certainly there has to be something left for me. And it says, in 33, then Isaac trembles violently. And he begs him, Esau begs him, giving me something else. And there's really no such thing as something else. There's really nothing else to give him. Isaac has already given him everything, right? Right. See, Esau says in 36, is he not rightly named Jacob? For he supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright and he's taken away my blessing. And he begs Isaac, give me something. Isaac says to him, I've already given it all to Jacob. There's nothing left. And then he gives him this like kind of curse, like this anti-blessing, right? It's really Jacob's blessing in reverse, right? Away from the fatness of the earth will be your home, and away from the dew of heaven on high. Totally true. This is what Edom is. It's this barren country where agriculture doesn't survive. And he says, by your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother, right? And this is the history of Israel and Edom, right? David comes in during his reign. Well, first Saul conquers a great deal of Edom, but David kind of finishes it off. When David takes Edom, he slaughters pretty much all of the males, all of the men he kills. He builds these garrisons. He makes them this vassal state that pays this outrageous tribute to Israel. Edom revolts a few times, sometimes successful, sometimes not, right? But at the end, Jacob says, Isaac says this, but when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck. And eventually Edom does. Edom eventually gets their freedom, but it's this vicious cycle, even up until the Maccabees, right? Judas Maccabee's son overruns Edom, right? Herod actually comes from which is the big gripe with Herod's, right? The Herodian dynasty is a descendant of the Edomites. This is why he's hated so much by the Jews. But this like any Devar, right? It comes to fruition. And it's not like this was written like after the fact, so people were looking back. It doesn't, right? It is the prophecy stands long before the history of Edom falls, when the Jewish nation falls. There's a lot of writing by the historian Josephus about Edom's history and how it fits into this prophecy. Another very interesting thing here is that the order that this happens. Remember when they come out of the womb? Esau comes first, and then Jacob. This is kind of the reversed order, right? Now Jacob has come first, and Esau, right, has come second. It's the reverse order of the womb. And yes, Jacob gets the blessing, and yes, Jacob will get the spiritual blessing in the next chapter. but none of their lives are ever the same again. You know, there's consequences for the free will. God's will triumphs, right? But there are consequences because they didn't trust God enough to allow the blessing to pass naturally, according to God's plans. Questions, comments about that? I'm so sorry. I think I've talked to you guys for like an hour. Does that help to put this into perspective?
Somewhat, I think so.
Yeah. Barbara, how do you feel about the free will thing?
Well, I mean, the way you were describing it, I mean, I understand
Mm-hmm.
his plan. It
Mhm.
goes forward. It doesn't matter, how we try to intervene, what we do. His plan is divine. I mean, it just,
Mm-hmm.
in spite of us, it
In spite of
goes on.
us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is the idea, especially, right? And like Suzanne said, yeah, it is part of the Abrahamic narrative, right? But we especially see this because this is really, like Jacob, he just doesn't stop. He's like such a trickster, right? And he takes a lot of things into his own hands, right? But the point of this narrative specifically is to say, you can do whatever you're going to do, and you can try as much as you want to thwart God's plan, but in the end, the sovereign God will always prevail. And so that makes free will really important for this story, right? Because it shows us the sovereignty of God. Right, and there's this beautiful this comparison. So these three patriarchs, right? So we see that Abraham's life was a life of authority and decision, right? What separates these patriarchs. Isaac is like a life of submission, right? And Jacob's life, as we're about to see, what we'll see in September when we reconvene after next week, is his life will be all trial and struggle. Jacob doesn't lead a peaceful life, much to his own doing, but he just doesn't, right? His whole life is just a struggle. I'm just seeing before we close if there's anything, right? So I just like a few quick things about this. So so how is Isaac fooled with this, right? He touches him, and I just want to say, just these odd things, is that goats in the Orient, this part of the country, they don't have the thick, coarse hair that we think of when we go to petting zoos, right? Their hair is much more silky, and in fact, I think it's a psalm that compares Solomon's hair to that of a goat, right? Because it's silky and soft. And so it would have been very believable for for Isaac to have touched Jacob. And so this feels like Isaac, it feels like Esau. Because goats just felt a lot smoother and silkier than they do in this part of the world. Also, why didn't he tell, Rebecca uses part of the flock, which would have been as dinner, right? Which would have been really, really rare in these times. People of Jacob's day, Abraham's day, did not eat animals of their own flock, right? Those animals had other purpose. It was rare that they ate meat for special occasions. Like if you remember Abraham having Sarah make the meal for the three visitors. But it would have been very rare. So why doesn't why doesn't Isaac taste the difference? Well, his senses are really off. But it would have been really garnished with almonds, with nuts, with raisins, right? There would have been other flavors in this. That's why Rebecca says, I'm going to make the stew the way your father likes it, right? So it kind of would have hidden that flavor. So it's just not like, gee, Isaac is stupid, and we certainly know he's not bedridden, right? Um, the Jews don't recline to eat until the Roman days. They sit to eat, and so Jacob helps Isaac out of bed. Isaac isn't just like fully incapacitated. Um, he's got a little bit left in him. He's got 60 some years left in him. Questions, comments about this? It's a great story. It's a very human story, right? We can see ourselves in a lot of these characters, I'm sure. But I hope that it gives you a little bit of different perspective on both Rebecca and Jacob. It would be a shame that, we've talked so much about Rebecca being like this kindred spiritual soul to Abraham, who is really the one that picks up and carries on the promise with faith, right? It would be a shame to see her story end thinking that she's just a schemer. So I hope it kind of gives you a different perspective on Rebecca. And for Jacob too. They're two of my favorite characters ever. So so we'll meet next week, and we will think about the story, if there's anything that we need to tie up before we see each other in September. If there's any loose ends, we can do that. And then we'll just talk about just the ending, the 41 through 46. There's some meat there that we probably should hash out, chew on a little bit. There's still some stuff left to be said about that I really don't want to open tonight. But if you have read this, I just want to have one caution, speaking of weaponization of scripture, that when Rebecca says to Isaac in 46, my life is so awful because he's married these women, and woe is me, right? My life is tortured because, and if Jacob does this, this will be the end of me. What good is my life? There are people today who have weaponized that to talk about interracial marriage. It does. Mhm.
Sorry.
Go ahead,
Her-
John.
Her complaint or lament
Mhm.
about Hittite women.
Mhm.
Jacob hasn't married one yet. This is just that the Hittite women are there, or
It's
her-
Esau.
it's
Esau has married them. Yeah. Esau has married the Hittite women.
All right, so we learned that at the very end of 26.
Yes. And again, it is again in 46, right? She brings it up again. She says to Isaac, I'm weary of my life because of the Hittite women, right? Meaning the ones that Esau has married. And if Jacob does that, that's going to be what good is my life? Jacob is not married at this point. Esau has a couple Hittite wives, and he'll try to redeem himself. He will marry into Ishmael's family, which is a little better than the Hittites. But but like I said, this part of scripture has been weaponized to talk about interracial marriage. Mhm.
But
And,
Tammy,
and mhm.
oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Barbara.
I thought the Hittites, though, it's not so much interracial as that they worship pagan gods, and she was afraid that would be brought into their home. That's what I kind of thought.
Yeah, and the fact that, remember, Abraham has set this precedent that they must only marry within the tribe, right? So they're outsiders. Probably outsiders is a better word if I said pagans, right? It's more so they're outsiders. And yeah, the fear is always that outsiders can contaminate. the pool, the purity of the pool, right? This was actually written, I don't want to give, spoiler alert, I want to dive into this more next week. This was probably added to the story during the exile or post-exile years when assimilation became really, really threatening to Israel, when it was really important for Israel to keep their purity, right? And we will delve into that, right? Because we'll see Paul get involved with that again with the Corinthians, right? From one point where he's saying, no, harmony is more important than purity. It's okay to associate with people outside the faith. But then in Second Corinthians, he kind of walks that back and says, no, don't. Purity is more important. So, so we'll delve into that next week. We'll leave that for next week. But yes, it is more that, Abraham has set this precedent that you're to keep marriage within the tribe. Because they were kind of pagans too. God, the Genesis never explains to us, right? How does Laban know about Yahweh? How does, I mean, they're probably pagans too. Terah, who is, who's Abraham's father, is certainly an idol maker. He's not into monotheism. Abraham is the first, that recognizes monotheism. The Bible never explains that quite to us, but Abraham sets that precedent, and because Esau crosses those lines and doesn't follow, makes his marriages illegitimate and his offspring illegitimate to the promise. Right? Remember the beginning of Genesis when we talk about that remnant, right? There's always a remnant that's going to carry the promise. And Jacob is the remnant. Now, it doesn't mean that God doesn't, we know that God has blessed Ishmael. It doesn't preclude them from God, right? God of all nations. Jacob is just the remnant who will carry the promise. Questions, comments before we close? Does that put this chapter in better perspective?
To me, it does.
Good. So I will see you guys next week. If you have any questions or comments, and Barbara, if you still want, because I know there's a second part of that question about Judas. I'm happy to talk to you about that also.
Okay.
Well,
I think you answered that.
Okay, good.
Basically, because it's all the same, really. It's it's the same question.
It is, and Barbara had sent me an email a couple days ago where she said, and correct me if I'm wrong with this, Barbara, that you saw a parallel between Jacob and Esau and Judas, right? This oracle destination.
Yeah, that's funny. I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, good, John. Good. Yeah, well, good. You're both on the same line. Believe it or not, that is a really highly debated and question that scholars do ask, right? So you really nailed a hot topic on the head. Yeah, because Christ says, he understands, right, that Judas is going to betray him. How does Christ know that? But very similar, right? And very similar explanations as the oracle destiny, right, of Esau and Jacob.
Hmm.
So well done. It's great. I'm so impressed that you guys are able to piece these together, right? It begins to make the Bible a whole instead of, just separate stories that don't connect. And that's really what I really, really, in all of these Bible studies, hope that we can achieve, to see the Bible as one continuous story, not 66 books that are like, just unrelated. And so as you see these similarities, it's important to recognize them and talk about them and see similarities in our own lives too. So if we are done, you can always write me a question and I promise I'll eventually get back to it. It won't leave you hanging high and dry. You can text me, you can call me, you can write me, and we'll finish up next week.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for
Okay.
sharing your Mondays with me.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good night. Thank
You
you.
too. Blessings. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So maybe let's think about this situation where this was green. That would have to be 2. This would be 9. And now we know this would be 6. This would be 5. Because that can't be 5. So we'd get a 9 here. We'd have 9s in those cells very specifically. A 9 in one of those 2 or one of those 2. This is a propagating stuff. I don't know, we're kind of keep butting up against this line, and the fact that I don't know anything about it. Right. I was making good progress, and I ground to a ball. This is either a yellow, pink, yellow and pink, or a green and blue. Line, definitely. That is just as a concept. Really, it really isn't. This line, I know it can't be more than 15 to get 2 pairs in a single box. In fact, it can't be 15 because if those added up to 15, that pair would be 30. Plus 11 is 41. These would have to add up to 4 to get to the magic total of 45, which is the secret inside every row of box. So and they can't just add up to 4. So 14 is the maximum. These can't both be 14 for a slightly different reason, because one, they would have to be the 2 different flavors of 14, and this 14 edge couldn't be one of those 2 flavors without crashing a digit. So these eggs are somewhere between 5 and 13. I'm very skeptical that they're not 5. If they were, those would add up to 10, plus the 11 there. These would be 9, 8, 7 to get to 20 to 45. That's just not impossible. Maybe that is what's happening, but why? Why am I meant to be able to tell that that's happening? Blue is in one of those 3. It doesn't mean it's on the line. Seven cages are redolent history as well. What's going on with them? Okay, if this added up to, this can't add up to 6, because this line can't add up to 6, I think. No, I'm wrong about that. I was thinking it can't be a 2, 4 pair because it would break this 5 pair. But it could be the 1, 5 pair if the yellow pink was a 2, 3 pair. Then probably that would be 1 and that would be 5. And this would be a 2, 4 pair, 6, 12, 23. Yeah, I don't know. That's some of the really combinations are possible, like 9s or 10s. I don't think so. How about this 11 gauge? I mean, if these were adding to 5, these digits would be the 1, 2, 3, 4 set, and that would be a 5, 6 pair. This digit is from 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. That's 7 in this case because they need to be 2. I don't know. Oh, it's not. Is it? Is this about 6? Oh, that's an absolute monster of a pool. It's something about the way these blue lines are ducking, are kind of ducking between boxes, rows and columns. Okay, I don't know. I'm going to get rid of the color for now. And I'm going to color, I don't know, this. Yeah, this is interesting. Let's color that row against this column, because there's a lot of matching there. I'm going to be adding things in a moment. Right. I'm also going to color this row because of that matching to that. I'm going to color this row light blue and this column violet. Or am I? Yeah, I'm going to. And then this one light blue. And I bet by symmetry, yes, it's this one violet. Yeah, look at that. Right. So set theory, which stands for set equivalence theory, i.e. set equivalence theory, is the principle by which you know that there are certain sets of digits 1 to 9 in a Sudoku puzzle, and you can eliminate them against each other. And I think, I don't know, we might learn nothing new doing this, but there's definitely a setup here that it's all about. So